Welcome to Talent Matters, the podcast where talent, skills and grit take centre stage. I'm your host, Donal O'Donoghue, and this is episode 10. The podcast is sponsored by Sanderson, talent solutions that transform businesses globally, and Finero, the multi-award-winning tax experts who support financial success for contractors, freelancers and solopreneurs. In this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by author and Chartered Psychologist, Dr. Denise O'Dwyer. Hi, Denise.
Hi, Jonah.
Thank you for your patience on that terrible intro. Thanks for coming in and doing this. How are things?
Thanks for having me. Very well, thanks. Yeah, delighted to be here.
So we have to start, as we always do on the podcast, to understand a little bit. And I suppose as a psychologist, you'll be all into family of origin and the importance of that and how talent emerges early in life. So what was life like for you growing up?
Yeah, I had a pretty normal upbringing, I guess. I'm the youngest of 6 in a very high achieving family. So we're all pretty scattered at this stage. We moved a lot. Let's just say I had an ambitious dad. So we moved quite a bit. But that was good from the point of view of, I suppose, you just become more adaptable to different surroundings and circumstances when you're forced into doing that. But yeah, had always enjoyed friends, family, the usual activities growing up. And I suppose I always had a big interest in people. So that's probably one of the reasons why I was kind of prompted to go into psychology. It was either that or move in the direction of fashion, which seem, like polar opposites, but actually there's quite a bit of similarity.
And you grew up in the west of Ireland, was it?
No. Well, I've been in Galway kind of pretty much, since I finished in university, really. But we moved quite a bit. So I was born actually originally in Drogheda, and we kind of moved then. With each time my dad changed posts, the rest of the family obviously moved with him. So, went to university in Dublin. And as I said, then did a bit of travelling, and I've been in Galway for the best part of 20 years.
Very good.
Yeah.
And what kind of student were you? What were you like when you were in secondary school?
I won't say I was overly studious. I was probably, I was always interested in sport, loved fashion, always had lots of friends. I worked when the time came to it, but I was probably a bit of a procrastinator. I had a tendency to sort of leave things till the last minute, and I was probably more interested in the social side of things than my studies. But I did fine. I did well in school. Yeah.
What sparked the interest in psychology, and when did that happen?
I suppose I was always kind of interested in people and kind of the idiosyncrasies of people and human nature and kind of what sparks people, what excites them, what ignites them. So that just kind of led me to that kind of general space, I guess.
And in terms of, what is important to perform well in the field, like, tell us a little bit about you're not a clinical psychologist, are you? Or
counselling psychologist.
Counselling psychologist.
Yeah.
So you might just, for the listeners, describe
Sure.
like the difference between, say, clinical psychologist, counselling psychologist, and the different paths that you looked at and then the path you decided to take.
Yeah. So I always say to people, if you want to really go to the very nth degree in psychology, be prepared to pretty much give up all of your 20s because, it really takes as long to do medicine. So I was studying kind of for the best part of 8.5 years by the time I did my doctorate and whatever else. So it does take time. I guess I finished as I said, I did my primary degree in UCD. Then I did a postgrad in business in the Smurfit School, UCD. Oh. Then, because at that stage I kind of thought I'd go into organisational psychology. Then I did my master's in Belfast, and that was in applied psychology, and then I did my doctorate in the UK. But I actually was working full time when I did my doctorate, so it was like a practitioner doctorate. So yeah, let's just say I had no life for those 3.5 years that I was working and studying at the same time. But there's kind of so many, I suppose, areas that you can go into in psychology at the moment. My work kind of takes me, I work primarily in adult mental health. And I do a bit of work as well with young offenders. But I have worked in pretty much all clinical areas of psychology. So there's a lot of kind of, I suppose, boundaries that you end up kind of crossing lines, regardless of whether you're in counselling or clinical. You end up kind of, as I said, my area is more working with adults with various disabilities. So I'm principal psychologist with rehab, with the National Learning Network, which is kind of the training stream of Rehab Group. So I love my work, I have to say, love what I do. I don't think I'd survive. I think we spend so much time working. It's so important to enjoy what you do. Like I'd hate to be in that situation that some people find themselves, on a Sunday night dreading work on a Monday morning. But so yeah, it's always new, it's always exciting. I'm always meeting different clients, which kind of keeps me inspired and on my toes all the time.
Brilliant. So what inspired you or what motivated you to write the book? So your book is Psychology with a Sparkle.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So again, I suppose I've always enjoyed writing. I was always kind of quite creative in that sense. And a book was kind of always on my radar, kind of one of those bucket list activities that it was just a question of when I was going to get around to doing it. And so I suppose I was probably, as I said, I work full time. So I was probably kind of writing the book for the best part of 3.5 to 4 years. I kind of did most of my main writing, I guess, during COVID. And I suppose I noticed a trend that kind of a lot of the same themes seem to be presenting for people. So stuff like, fear, anxiety, imposter syndrome, just the various reasons that people are held back from reaching their full potential in life. Relationships is another big one that was presenting for people. So I kind of thought if I had a means or a method to put all of that information into a condensed format, that could be accessed by not just professionals, but to the everyday person, who wants to better themselves, who maybe, doesn't particularly want to see a psychologist in person, but, might actually pick up a book that has kind of all of those condensed themes. And I deliberately wrote it in such a way that it would be attractive, I suppose, to, readers as well as non-readers, so that you can kind of pick it up and read a chapter, or you can read the book from start to finish. So,
and what's the sparkle?
It's
a great title, but it's an unusual one. Yeah.
Yeah. So the sparkle, I suppose that kind of allowed me, like initially I was offered, in fact, to publish with academic publishers, but they actually wanted me to change the title, and I was kind of quite, I suppose, attached to the title myself, because I thought it offered kind of a modern sort of a contemporary edge, and it allowed me, because there is a very kind of a distinct style of writing in psychology. So by kind of adding the sparkle piece, it kind of allowed me to enter that creative space a little bit more. Because the book is inspired. I mean, obviously it's inspired by, my clients, by, all things psychology. But it's also inspired by, lots of other things like, writing, film, music, comedy, fashion, all of those things. But most of all, I guess, all the wonderful clients that I've worked with over the years. So
brilliant. And you talk in the book about maladaptive thinking patterns a little bit. What are they, and how can people overcome them? So
maladaptive thinking patterns are faulty thinking patterns, essentially, in very simple terms. And they generally form quite early and become embellished, I guess, as we go through life. So essentially, we develop faulty thinking patterns through, generally they're very much influenced by, people of influence like our parents, our teachers, who have maybe instilled ideas or beliefs into our minds that we carry with us into adulthood, but they don't always necessarily serve us, and they can in fact end up really holding us back in life. And I suppose that's where it's helpful to work with a psychologist to dismantle some of those kind of faulty thinking patterns that can really hold us back in life. And I suppose there's been a lot of research on the whole idea of neuroplasticity, which is, that whole idea that our brains are very malleable and that we can shape them in terms of not only in terms of structure, but also in function. And that's been proven through, brain images and also through people who've experienced an acquired brain injury, that we know that, we can essentially shape our brains depending on what we focus on. So if we focus on the negative stuff, obviously we're going to have those maladaptive thinking patterns. But if we actually train our brains to focus on the positive stuff, then obviously that's going to be reflected with a positive life and a positive outcome, But it takes work. It's not like it kind of happens overnight for people. If you're 30 or 40 odd years thinking in a particular way, it takes a bit of work, but it's not insurmountable. It's absolutely possible to change how we think and to have a brighter outlook and a brighter focus.
Yeah, I mean, as somebody who grew up in Dublin in the 70s and 80s, and when I think about we had some great teachers and we had some not so great teachers, and I was just after the corporal punishment era. Okay. But there was still a bit of it going on in our school, and it's amazing the influence that some of those, like the great influence that really good teachers can have, and the destructive influence that ones that are less so can have.
Absolutely.
In terms of relationships, the book talks a little bit about, I suppose, improving relationships. What are some of the kind of key areas that you explore?
So relationships is, it's really, as I said, it's like a huge area. So many people, and that's why there's actually 3 chapters. There's one devoted to friendships, there's one devoted to attachment styles, there's another one devoted to the intimacy, sexual side of relationships. And that's actually the chapter, interestingly or not so interestingly enough, that's actually the chapter that has got quite a bit of focus. Because I suppose we're all interested in, how to improve our romantic relationships in particular. And I suppose within the first kind of 18 to 24 months of any relationship, you have that spark and you have that passion and whatever. And it's generally it's easier to maintain the kind of intimacy spark for people. Beyond that, it takes a little bit more work. And, when you start introducing things like, children and whatever financial pressures or whatever, just life in general, things get more complex as we get older. It takes more work to keep relationships intact. And oftentimes it is that intimacy, sexual side of a relationship that can suffer when as our lives become more complicated. And I suppose that's why people are always interested to know, well, how do I keep the passion alive, or how do I keep the spark alive? But I suppose it's first and foremost, in order to be successful in any relationship, be it romantic or otherwise, we have to do the work on ourselves, because we've all grown up and we've all been experienced, different traumas, whether that's trauma with a big T or a little t. Sometimes people have this perception of trauma that it has to be the really big stuff, but it doesn't. It can be exactly as you mentioned there, if you were somebody who was a victim of corporal punishment, that would have had an impact. But we bring all of that stuff into our relationships with us. So in order to kind of make sure that we're not self-sabotaging or that we're not pointing the finger of blame all the time to our partner, we need to do the work ourselves on, what's the stuff that I'm carrying, and maybe, there's the good stuff, but then there's the not so good stuff that really impacts on a relationship and, can lead to kind of the more destructive side of things, And I suppose I talk a bit in the book about there's a lot of things that we can do, like there's, I was reading a book actually recently with John and Julie Gottman, and they've done extensive research on, kind of love and romance and relationships and all of that. And, in actual fact, you know, sometimes like we hear a lot of the narrative nowadays, you know, and especially on the net, is to do with, you know, attachment styles and how they impact relationships and abandonment wounds and love languages and all of that. But actually, what they've come up with in their research is it's actually the basic pillars of, you know, respect, mutual respect, understanding, giving people the place and the space to talk about if something is upsetting them, you know, affording our significant others the same time and attention and listening ear that we would with, you know, somebody that we barely know. Oftentimes we give strangers more attention than we do our significant others. So that you have to have those fundamentals right in order to, you know, have the other stuff for the sexual intimacy, for that to be right. So it's really, you know, it's not just, you know, Esther Perel as well. She's somebody else who's done lots of research and work around relationships and what makes successful relationships. And she talks about this idea that, you know, in times past, we kind of look to our partners for, you know, financial stability, for, you know, emotional significance, for erotic desire, whatever the case is. But that in actual fact, in order to have a successful relationship, we have to pour into our own cups first, so that we're bringing the best version of ourselves to the relationship, you know. So there's lots there, and it's not just one thing, you know. There's so many different factors that are involved in, you know, even down to our communication style, that, you know, sometimes we underestimate. You can deliver the same message but in two very different ways. And
So
you know,
true.
Yeah, like it can come across as a complaint or a criticism. So a complaint, you know, offers us a chance to be vulnerable and to kind of express something maybe that we're not happy with. But a criticism is, you know, an attack usually on somebody's character. So it's so important that you separate the person from the behavior, you know. So instead of, you know, saying to somebody, you're so selfish, you know, to kind of reframe that in such a way that it's not as harsh on the other side, that you say to your partner, well, you know, when you do that, or if you stay out half the night and you don't contact me, it makes me feel lonely or sad or nervous or anxious or whatever the case is. So you're bringing it back to the emotion, the emotional effect, as distinct from, you know, an assassination on the other person's character.
Yeah, and I suppose that's very true from a theoretical perspective, but it's also not a good thing when people are generally out half the night and not contacting their other half. There's certainly red flags and alarm bells. But I really agree with what you're saying, because I think in the early part of relationships, when there's I suppose that infatuation and excitement, it's very easy, and I think what really stands the test of time in relationships is that conflict resolution piece, isn't it? It's how you can be heard and how you can address things in a way that are I suppose respectful and non-threatening and so on.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other thing that you mentioned there was attachment styles. So just for our viewers or listeners who aren't familiar, could you give us a little overview of the different attachment styles?
Yeah, so there's secure attachment style, there's avoidant attachment style, and there's anxious attachment style. And I suppose secure attachment style, that's the one that we're all kind of aspiring towards, you know. You know, I suppose that's where you're just generally more robust, you're more solid, you're resilient. You don't get overly excited about, you know, one way or another. You're, you know, pretty much kind of in the middle, and you can kind of take whatever comes along. Anxious attachment style is just as we were talking about, you know, where, for like that as an example, if your partner is out, that you text them 10 million times and ring them, you know, just as many times, because you have that anxious attachment where you need to know, and it's very difficult for you to kind of develop trust, really. That's really what's at the root of it, you know. And
that may be carried from something from a previous relationship where trust was broken.
Yeah, or well, actually even before that. I mean, it goes right back to childhood. Our attachment styles are formed in childhood. And there's lots of attachment research. It was Bowlby was actually the psychologist responsible for attachment research to begin with, but it's kind of now that it's become like that really popular. Everyone seems to be talking about attachment styles. And then the avoidant attachment, obviously I'm summarising here, but the avoidant attachment style then is, you know, somebody who needs lots of space, you know, lots of, you know, find it more difficult to attach essentially, and where the anxious person wants to be closer to their significant other all the time, the avoidant person needs lots of space and lots of time apart. So it's really, once you kind of get to understand somebody's attachment style, you know, that really is the key thing, then you'll end up having a better relationship because there will be that level of understanding. But it's kind of helping the person to kind of figure that out in the first place, because otherwise we can end up just reacting to people, and that can cause conflict, like huge amounts of conflict. But secure attachment, that's the goal. And
That's the goal.
Yeah.
And what about, just as another kind of, I suppose it's slightly different point, when it comes to people's levels of extroversion or introversion, what do you see? Do you see that people who are higher in extroversion typically work well together, or do you see kind of introverts and extroverts kind of?
Yeah, I mean, like, it's hard to kind of say, you know, what's the gold standard, or what works better, what doesn't work. I mean, generally speaking, if you have similar interests, similar values, that's a big one.
Values are huge, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. That can be conducive to a good relationship. But equally then you'll find couples who are polar opposites and somehow they manage to make it work. So really it is about understanding your significant other, you know, and knowing what you're getting yourself into. And I suppose a lot of the time what happens for people is if they enter relationships where there is that like huge amount of passion in the early stages, but not very much kind of emphasis put on the emotional connection, those relationships tend to burn out very fast, you know. And what you'll generally find is then people will end up in difficulty further down the road if they haven't actually figured out, is there compatibility here, you know, or is it just desire, you know, and attraction. So I suppose that's where it comes back to those pillars of, you know, are we emotionally suited to each other, and do we have similar values? Is there enough here to sustain us? And most of all, you know, is there a friendship? You know?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. There's got to be the friendship. There has to be the respect, and I think goals are important as well in terms of that, where the relationship and what the vision for life looks like, and how aligned people are on that. I suppose at the life stage that I find myself at now, a lot of my friends are on the second time around, you know, maybe because I suppose since divorce has become more prevalent in the country. But a lot of what I'm hearing is just about levels of toxic relationships. So how would you kind of summarize or describe toxic relationships and the drivers of those?
Yeah. Well, I suppose I'd be out of a job if there wasn't toxic relationships. So I can't knock them completely. But yeah, I mean, as you say, so many people find themselves in like horrendous situations for whatever set of reasons. But I think really, you know, if you start to kind of find yourself losing a sense of yourself, you know, and you become completely lost in the relationship, or obviously, I mean, you know, it goes without saying, if there's abuse of any description, then you need to be obviously getting out of that situation. But I think, you know, sometimes what happens to people is their tolerance level, you know, is almost increased if they're in that kind of a toxic situation. So they can't kind of define the wood from the trees, you know, because they're so used to being in a certain pattern of behaviour with somebody that that looks like normal. And it's only like that if they're talking to a friend like yourself who's coming from a completely different perspective. And, you know, maybe they end up telling you a story or telling you something, and your reaction will actually inform them probably more than anything else in terms of like what's normal and what's kind of like not acceptable behaviour, you know. But I think if you have I mean, we all know we don't really need, a thunderbolt to come down from the sky. We all know when we're being mistreated or when we're in a situation, that's not good for us. So it really is about kind of standing back from something and being really honest and going to talk to somebody. If you are like in any way, having doubts or have concerns, then, make sure you at the very least, talk to a friend and get their perspective. But essentially, anything that you think possibly could be toxic, it probably is, because you wouldn't be having that thought.
Yeah, but I think the fact that, as you said, it almost becomes the norm for people that are in that situation. So another thing that you talked about that I thought was interesting was the concept of sparkling fluidity.
Oh, yeah.
What's that?
Yeah, so like sparkling fluidity, generally the people who are the most resilient, the most robust, that can kind of cope with adversity the best. If you think about them, they're quite fluid people. They don't get overly excited about things. And I always think like nature is one of our best teachers. And if you think about like a tree, it has very solid roots, very robust, but yet its branches, can kind of move in the wind. It can withstand all weather conditions. And it's the same for ourselves in that, if you think about physical flexibility, for example, like when our joints and our muscles are physically supple and flexible, we tend to move with more ease, on a very functional level. And it's no different for our mental flexibility, mental capability, that when we have that kind of an adaptability, if we can cope with the different life changes that happen, and become even more pronounced as we make our way through life, if you have that mental agility, that mental flexibility, you tend to cope better with things, So not only do you have an understanding of yourself and do you have that kind of self-resilience, but you also have an understanding of other people. You don't become overly attached to a specific outcome going your way. You're kind of cool either ways, whatever happens.
But how much of it is your kind of natural predisposition and how much of it can be worked on? Because as you said, I think we all know people that are really tolerant to stress, take everything in their stride, are able to keep moving forward in the face of some really tough adversity. And then we also know people who kind of bottle it all up, keep it all in, and are almost like a pressure cooker. So there's obviously a natural predisposition that we all have. But how much can be worked on?
Yeah, I suppose that's where things like, what we would call third wave therapies, the likes of mindfulness, meditation, compassion focused therapy, that's where they really come into play. Because, and they've been very much influenced by Eastern psychology. That's where they have their roots, but have proven hugely successful for people. Like there's like a huge amount of research that has backed up, how mindfulness, meditation and the application of those in our daily lives, how they can vastly improve our resilience, our ability to deal with life in a more adult manner, and again, it's something that takes practice. And a lot of the time when you're working with clients, they'll say things like, I've done that, I've tried that, it doesn't work. But it's like anything. You have to, really give it a fair chance. You can't just, be an advanced level when you're actually only a beginner, when you're only starting out. So you have to give it time. So exactly as you say, some people are kind of born and they're naturally, have that kind of capacity to be a bit more resilient. More of us have to work on it. But it is a muscle that can be strengthened for sure.
Good to know. Another point that's come up, I suppose, recently in conversations. So in episode 9, we talked a little bit about imposter syndrome, and it's something that you've talked about that I think everybody suffers with at different times. Tell us a little bit about how that manifests in people.
Yeah, again, that's something that has kind of come very much to the fore, I guess, imposter syndrome in recent years. And essentially what it describes is feeling like you don't measure up whether it's in a work capacity, in a relationship capacity, in general life, but that you're almost kind of waiting to be found out, that somebody's going to find you out as being a fraud, despite evidence to the contrary. Because what you'll often find when you work with people who have imposter syndrome is that these people often have like master's degrees, PhDs, and yet they might describe to you that they feel stupid in a work context, or, so it's about dismantling that belief system again and really trying to work with the person around reconstructing those thoughts to something that's more positive. And again, it goes back to what we spoke about earlier, which is those core beliefs, which we develop from a very early age, and looking to see, well, clearly they're not serving you any longer, and they've become strengthened over the years, but actually we need to dismantle those beliefs, and so that you have better. So in psychology terms, imposter syndrome would probably have been known as, your self-concept. So having a positive self-concept. So it's really trying to strengthen that self-concept as opposed to constantly doubting yourself, because that's what imposter syndrome, that's how it manifests, in self-doubt.
Yeah, so it's self-doubt, not feeling good enough, not feeling worthy, and that thought or that fear of being found out.
Yeah.
So I suppose, are there tools? I mean, obviously, if you're working with a psychologist or a counsellor, that's an option. But for someone who's maybe feeling a little bit, are there tools or techniques that somebody can use to help kind of reduce those kind of limiting beliefs or self-doubt?
Well, they can read Psychology with a Sparkle.
It's a good place to start. Shameless plug. And there will be a link to it in the show notes, definitely.
Thanks, Donal. Yeah, I mean, there are things that we can do. We can do things like, we can journal. We can, focus on gratitude. Things like gratitude has been shown to help massively for people to, again, help them to focus in the direction of what's working in their life as distinct from what's not working, And oftentimes, set yourself a goal. Like you spoke about goals earlier, Donal, and they can be, hugely significant, because when we accomplish a goal, it gives us a sense of confidence. It gives us a sense of self-assurance. So, anything that you can kind of do for yourself where you get like even a tiny little hit of achievement.
Dopamine.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to say dopamine.
Yeah,
because
but
it's like the incentive
absolutely.
reward system, isn't it? You hit that little milestone on the way to
Absolutely.
doing something, you feel good about it.
100%. Yeah. So that, that will that's like the antidote to self-doubt, if you think about it. So you're all the time just looking for ways to try and also kind of, not to be held back by fear. Like, we all experience fear, but if you look at like some of the greatest leaders in the world, they'll all attest to feeling the fear but pushing through it, So if you can really kind of develop and cultivate that mindset of, well, okay, I feel fearful, but I'm actually just going to do this anyway, So I'm going to put on my runners and go for that run, even though I don't particularly feel like doing it, or I'm afraid to go to the gym, but I'm not going to do it because I know I'll feel better afterwards. So it's kind of pushing through those fears and those limited thinking patterns that we can all experience from time to time.
Super. And it's funny because I spent time in my earlier life coaching sports and coaching martial arts. And when I started training, we always, I suppose, the early view was that, some people were predisposed to, physically being good, or some people were more courageous than others. But actually, through coaching hundreds of, kids and teens and adults, you actually learn that courage is actually something that you can develop, and bravery and resilience. It is something that can really be developed, and it's all about those small steps and rewarding yourself along the way, and moving those in those incremental steps.
Yeah.
In terms of your own life and experience, what have been some of the tougher challenges you've had to deal with?
Gosh, where to start? I guess I'm I'm not really sure where to start with that one. I've had, there's one chapter in particular, I suppose, maybe that's what you're leaning towards, where I was a little bit more vulnerable, a little bit more, I suppose, shared more of my own personal history, which was I was somebody who would have suffered with eating disorders, earlier when I was going to college. And, my parents were separating. I was finding all that difficult. And yeah, so that kind of took up a lot of headspace in my life and took me a long time and a lot of trial and error before I kind of figured my way out of all of that. And I suppose it is really with any kind of life situation or life trial, it really is about finding what works for you. So what necessarily worked for me may not work for the next person. And it really is about finding a bespoke system for yourself that's going to work, and to talk to the right people and to get, for me, I suppose I held a lot of unnecessary shame, which kind of kept me locked in silence for a long time. And I suppose as psychologists, we always look for protective factors. So what are the things that keep people going despite the fact that they might be going through something really significant? And I suppose for me, it was that I always had great friends, a great friend circle. And despite the fact that I was kind of going through stuff within myself, I always had people around me that, I could lean on, and that I was, even though I spoke about it to very, very few, but I did have that support system, and so I think oftentimes even there, when you ask me the question, I kind of struggled to find the words for a few seconds, but it's really just getting to a place and a space where something is holding you back in your life, and unless you address it, it's going to prevent you from actually reaching the goals and the desires and the things that you want to achieve in your life. And certainly for me, I knew that it was something that was an issue and had become a problem, and I needed to kind of get to the bottom of it and, come out the other side. And thankfully, and it's something like in terms of the wellness tools that I would have developed when I kind of came out the other side of that, I still use those to this day,
It's that added insight though, isn't it?
Yeah.
When you know what's, as you said, what works for one person may not work as well for someone else,
Exactly.
but there's that extra insight, isn't there, in terms of what's worked really well. When you think about, because obviously you have a huge interest in people, and when you think, what's it all about? What's important to you in life? How do you define success? I'm kind of asking you, what's the meaning of life? Do you know what I mean?
Is your name gay?
And I'm thinking about it because I've had conversations with people recently about all sorts of things, about careers and success and challenge and bereavement and all the different things that we go through. And I suppose it does make people reflect at different times when they've overcome personal challenges and battles, etc. So when you think about life and when you think about what's important, give us that in a nutshell.
Okay. I think, it sounds very cliched, but it really is important to create and cultivate as many happy moments as you can, because, and to find what it is that gives you that sense of happiness on a day-to-day basis, and because, a lot of the time life is kind of quite samey. So when we get those like moments, celebrate them. Like if there are really happy moments, like make sure you celebrate them. And, there's a time for everything, as I say, but to really focus on cultivating a life where you are fulfilling your true purpose. And, to listen to the desires of your heart, because they're really what are going to lead you to what it is that's going to fulfill your true purpose, and if you're not living your true purpose, you'll feel that tug on your heart and in your psyche that will tell you and will continue to tell you until you listen to it. You're not doing, or you're not in the area that you're supposed to be in, whether that's in a relationship that you're not supposed to be in a line of work that you're not supposed to be in, whatever the case is. But it's really, and I suppose that's where that introspective piece is really important again, which we're all about in psychology, reflection and introspection, that look within and really start to listen to the whispers of your heart, and what it's trying to tell you, what it's trying to communicate with you. Because the more that you do that, the more you will be led to that happy place of, what you need to do in order to create that life where you're going to feel fulfilled, and you're going to wake up in the morning excited for the day ahead, and you have kind of plans and projects in mind in terms of, where you want to go, what you want to do. And you have that sense of motivation and a pep in your step, And of course, there's always going to be tough days, obviously. But again, you'll have hopefully built up that little bit of toughness, that little bit of resilience through working on yourself, And I mean, I'm on a mission anyway to make therapy cool for everybody. So, I think we should all be attending a psychologist or a counsellor or of some description, engaging to some extent in, personal development, even if it's just whatever, reading stuff online, but that you dedicate some part of your day to personal development, because that's actually how you start to get to know yourself.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think to summarize that, it's almost like the answers are within if you actually have the introspection to listen to yourself.
Yeah.
And I saw something, it just came up on social media the other day. I don't know who said it, but it was like, nothing that you can buy in the, in the shops you're going to give a damn about in 10 years time.
Absolutely.
And actually it's all about those moments. And, nobody, when they are thinking or facing their last moments on the planet, are going to wish that they spent more time at their desk. It's going to be about those connections with people and family, and that's what it's all about. So I think you've summed that up absolutely beautifully. So Denise, I would like to say thank you so much for coming in. We'll put your social media into the show notes, so
Perfect.
if people want to find you, we'll also put a link to the book Psychology with a Sparkle, which is a great read and makes psychology very accessible for people, which I think was one of the kind of drivers behind the project. And if you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube and follow us on Instagram. It's @talentmatters_podcast. Thanks again to our sponsors Sanderson and Finero, and we'll see you next time.